So as you can probably see from the small section you can see here, I've got quite a large book haul. I don't know how these book hauls seem to accumulate, but I've been sent a lot of books by publishers recently that I'm actually genuinely really excited for, as well as picked up a few books of my own. So I am, of course, yes, here to do another book haul. This pile goes a lot further down than you can actually see in the camera right here, so I'm not going to dilly-dally, I'm going to get straight into it and show you the books. To start with, I actually thought I would show you the book I just took out of the library. Now when I take books out of the library these days, I tend to take out books I plan to read immediately, very soon. I only take out 1 or 2 at a time just because I already have so many books around me. But I did take out of the library Titus Andronicus by Shakespeare. This is the Arden Shakespeare edition. This is just the edition that my library had, but there's a lot of extra material in here. But I have been meaning to read this play for the longest time. Well, maybe about a year. That feels like ages, since I really discovered that this play by Shakespeare is in part inspired by the ancient Greek myth of Procne and Philomela. Now, the myth of Procne and Philomela is a myth very central to my PhD thesis. One of the chapters is specifically focused on Procne and Philomela, and although this isn't going to be a part of my thesis in any way, my thesis doesn't deal with receptions, I did just want to read somebody else's sort of retelling of that myth. I just found that such a fascinating concept that someone had retold that myth that I am so focused on and has consumed so many of my thoughts over the past few years that I just wanted to read this. And I have been meaning to read more Shakespeare as well. I haven't actually read any Shakespeare since I left secondary school, so hopefully this will get me back into Shakespeare and I'm excited to read it. The next book was sent to me by the publisher, and it's a book I actually specifically requested because I really wanted to finish it, and it is The Accusation by Bandy. I've mentioned before that I was reading this one. I was reading it on my Kindle, but I found recently using the Kindle aggravates my RSI and my wrists, so I've been steering towards physical books, and like I mentioned, the publisher were kind enough to send me the physical copy of this book so I could read and review it for you. This is a collection of short stories by a North Korean author who goes by the pseudonym Bandy, as when this book was being released they were still in North Korea. A bit of secrecy attached to that in this being released because it kind of exposes the traumas faced by people living in North Korea in their everyday lives, and the stories I have read in this are very hard-hitting and fascinating, and I just think this book as a whole is a very fascinating book and well worth checking out from what I've read, so I'm excited to finish this one. The next book I actually picked up in Fopp, and Fopp is a record shop in the UK that I've mentioned before. I often pick up cheap books in because they sell their books for £3 or 2 for £5, and they always have some really interesting picks in there. I've found some great books, and the one I picked up this time is The Magus by John Fowles. This will be my second John Fowles book. I previously read his novel The Collector, which came out in the 60s and was one of the original sort of stalker stories, and that was a very dark and intriguing book, but this is another book by the author, one I know a little bit less about, but the blurb has always stood out to me and sounded really interesting, and I equally think it's going to be as dark as The Collector. So I'm just going to read you the back because that's pretty much all I know about it. But it's set on a remote Greek island where Nicholas Yurf finds himself embroiled in the deceptions of a master trickster. As reality and illusion intertwine, Yurf is caught up in the darkest of psychological games. Thought the other book was really well written, so I'm definitely intrigued to read something else by him. The next 2 books were all shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction this year in 2018, and I was kindly sent the entire shortlist, but the first 3 to come to hand here are the paperbacks that I'm most excited for, so I'm going to share those with you. The first one is Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. I have heard such high praise for this novel that although I'm not that familiar with the concept, so many people love it, I'm willing to give it a shot. It reads an intimate portrait of a family and an epic tale of hope and struggle. Sing Unburied Sing examines the power and limitations of family bonds. So yeah, not something I would necessarily pick up in a bookshop, but this is why I like the Women's Prize for Fiction, because it makes me pick up things that I don't necessarily gravitate towards in the bookshop, and because of that I've discovered some favourites in the past, like Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo, which was one of my favourite books of last year, if not my favourite. I then have Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi. This one I have been meaning to read for ages because it is also based on a Greek myth. It's based on the Greek myth of Antigone, which you may have heard of through the Sophocles play of the same name. This book, however, is set in modern times, so it's not a Greek myth retelling set in antiquity, it's set in the contemporary world. And I'm always curious to see what authors do with myths, or the themes of myths, or the stories of myths in a contemporary setting, how they pull out those themes that are still relevant and find parallels. I find fascinating, so I'm really excited for this one. And then we have When I Hit You by Meena Kandasamy. This one has been absolutely raved about by Simon over at Savage Reads, so much so that I'm all the more excited for it and want to pick it up all the sooner. This one is about a relationship of domestic abuse. This one is about a woman whose partner abuses them and how they're not necessarily the couple you look at on the street and think they have an abusive relationship. It's about how individuals in relationships and couples can surprise you. It's about a woman who's in love with a man who may seem like he stands up for wonderful causes and everything he believes in other walks of his life, but then can be incredibly sexist and treat his partner terribly. And I think this was just going to be incredibly raw and emotional, and I'm going to be picking it up ASAP. I then have a book that was offered to me by the publishers, and I hadn't heard of it, but I just thought the premise sounded fascinating, so said I would love to take a copy, and that's All the Good Things by Claire Fisher. This one was compared to Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine in tone, and that definitely pushed me towards it because I really enjoyed Eleanor Oliphant earlier this year. This one, however, centres on a young woman who's in prison who feels very strongly that she deserves to be there and does not deserve to be exonerated for her crime, but she is working with a therapist who is trying to take her through the events and what happened and what brought her to this place, and I imagine that unravels for the reader as it does for the protagonist, and I think this sounds really, really fascinating. I would be definitely very interested to read more books set in prisons, so I'm hoping that this one does live up to its comparison. I was then sent a new translation of The Art of Rhetoric by Aristotle from Oxford University Press, or Oxford World Classics. This was such a surprise to receive in the post, but I was so pleased to get it because I don't actually own my own copy of Aristotle's Rhetorics. And rhetoric, again, is the main focus of my thesis. I study rhetorical texts, I study court speeches and funeral speeches from classical Athens, and in this piece of non-fiction from antiquity, Aristotle, who was a famous philosopher in his day, writes about what makes rhetoric, what are the different types of rhetoric in antiquity, in the times he's living, what's required of the different forms. It is a text I've read bits of, but I've never read it cover to cover, and I don't have my own copy, so I'm so pleased to have this because I love ancient rhetoric. The next book I actually picked up for myself second hand, and it's The Ghost Bride, and look at this, does it not look in brand new condition? This one is set in the 1890s, and our protagonist has been asked to be a ghost bride for another family's recently departed son, which seems to be some sort of tradition in which it prevents their son going into the afterlife without having been married. Our protagonist Leland seems to be torn between helping her family, who would benefit from this union, and pursuing her own dreams and desires. But on top of that, I feel like there is some magical realism or fantasy elements in this story from the blurb, so I'm excited to see where those all lead. And yeah, I just thought it sounded like a really fascinating read. I then have a book I was sent by the publishers which I've already actually read, and I will link the wrap up in which I reviewed it for you if you're interested in more of my thoughts, but it's The Surface Breaks by Louise O'Neill. This was sent to me by the publisher Scholastic, and look at that cover. This is one of my favourite book covers I've seen all year. In fact, if you'd like me to do another video on beautiful book covers, I'd be happy to do that because I was thinking I'd not done one for a really long time. This would definitely make the cut though, I think. Look at that beauty. This is a feminist young adult retelling of The Little Mermaid, and I feel like that's pretty much all you need to know to go into this one. I really enjoyed reading it. It doesn't stray terribly far from the original Hans Christian Andersen narrative of the story, but Louise O'Neill uses that original structure and storyline to look at really important issues and to examine the expectations and treatment of women, and it's so wonderfully done, so would highly recommend this one. I then have a proof copy of a book which will obviously not look like that at the end, but it's Underwater Breathing by Cassandra Parkin. This one's out on the 3rd of May, so may or may not already be out. I think that's around the time I plan on uploading this video. In fact, it might be out today. who knows? But I was sent this by the publisher and I was really excited to be offered a copy because I've previously read Cassandra Parkin's collection of short stories, which were all retellings of classic fairy tales, and I adored this collection. It's one of my favourite collections of short stories of all time, and I'm just excited to read something else by Cassandra Parkin, although this is in this instance a novel as opposed to short stories. I will read you the back of this one, however. It reads, "On Yorkshire's gradual crumbling mud cliffs sits an Edwardian seaside house." Excellent setting. In the bathroom, Jacob and Ella hide from their parents' passionate arguments by playing the underwater breathing game, until the day Jacob wakes to find his mother and sister gone. Years later, the sea's creeping closer, his father is losing touch with reality, and Jacob is trapped in his past. Then, Ella's sudden reappearance forces him to confront his fractured childhood. As the truth about their parents emerges, it's clear that Jacob's time hiding beneath the water is coming to an end. Sounds really intriguing. I'm sure the prose will be as stunning as they were in her short story collection, so really excited to get to this one. I then have a thriller novel that I requested from the publisher that I'm so excited for. Maybe one of my next reads because I'm not sure I can restrain myself. But it is the new thriller novel by Julia Heberlin, Paper Ghosts. Last year I read 2 thrillers by Julia Heberlin, and in all fairness I didn't love the second one I read as much, but it was one of her first novels, whereas her more recent novel, Black Eyed Susans, was one of the best thrillers I've ever read. It had me on tenterhooks, I thought the pacing was fantastic, and I just enjoyed the overall reading experience so much that I think her writing can only stay at that level, if not get better. So I'm really excited to have her new novel. I'm just going to read you the first couple of sentences because I think they give you all the suspense you need, and that is, Carol Louise Fieldman is an old man who was once a celebrated photographer, before he was tried for the murder of a young woman and acquitted, before his admission to a care home for dementia. Now his daughter is taking him on a trip, only she's not his daughter, and if she has her way, he's not coming back. Okay, that's all I need to know. I loved, like I said, her other book. I'm just excited to see what other exciting thriller suspense plot she's come up with. My next book, however, is a little bit of non-fiction. Well, I say a little bit, but it's quite a lot of it. And that is A History of Women in 100 Objects by Maggie Andrews and Janice Lomas, or edited by these 2 women, and this was sent to me by the History Press, and I had not heard about it until they emailed me, but I thought the premise sounded so interesting. A concept that's not particularly novel, as we've seen other books like this, like A History of the World in 100 Objects, but this one specifically deals with a history of women through objects, and I've already read a few of the entries in here. They're all very short, sort of like 2 to 3 pages about a specific item, and you learn a little bit about its history and also its relevance to today, and I just thought that was so interesting, and I think the way it's done is so fascinating. A few of the items have been contributed and written about by other authors as well, and I feel like I'm going to learn a lot of things in this and also find a few new interests to pursue. So we have things in here like right at the beginning we have the earliest surviving skeleton of a hominin. So Homo sapiens are a type of hominin. If you've ever studied sort of prehistoric archaeology, you'll have touched upon that, and that was one of my favourite subjects in first year of uni, was when we looked at prehistoric evolution of different hominins into Homo sapien. But our earliest ancestor that would be considered a hominin as opposed to a sort of ape type creature is actually a female skeleton, so that was really interesting to me. We've got items like the Venus of Willendorf, Marie Curie's desk, Amelia Earhart's aeroplane, posters advertising food banks, so many different things in here covering a range of different topics in all some way relevant to the history of women and the treatment of women and women's lives, and I just think this is going to be so fascinating. I've enjoyed what I've read so far, and I'm sure I'm going to learn and discover a lot more as I go on. I can feel my feet when I'm with you. The next book is another one that was sent to me by the publishers, and it is The Water Cure by Sophie Mackintosh. I've seen a lot of buzz about this one online, offline. A lot of people seem to be talking about it, and it sounds very intriguing but also kind of clouded in mystery. I know it focuses on 3 women who live on a sort of, I guess, almost like a deserted island. They're pretty secluded from the rest of the world, and we don't really know what is going on in the rest of the world, but they live on this island with their mother and a king, and we don't know much else about what their lives are like, but it sounds quite dark and mysterious, and I believe their lives all change when three strange men wash up on their shores. So one that I will definitely be sharing my thoughts on when I get around to reading it, but it sounds really intriguing. I swear we're getting there, guys. The next book is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This is another one there's been tons of buzz about and you've probably seen mentioned online already. But again, I was sent a copy by the publishers after I requested it because I'd seen lots of other people talking about it and I caved to the hype. I wanted to read it, I wanted to know more, I wanted to know what all the hype was about. This one is published by Hotkey Books and it is a fantasy novel focused on the Fae or fairies, and I am so up for that. I loved fairies when I was a child. I was obsessed with fairies. I read so many children's books about fairies, but it's not something I've read a lot about as an adult, either in young adult or adult fiction, and I would love to read some books where fairies are the central magical creature. However, I know this is not a light and fluffy book, it is quite a dark book at the same time. In fact, it begins with a group of sisters witnessing their parents' murder and being dragged to the realm of the fairies, so I think that pretty much sets you up for what you're in store for, and I'm really excited to have a little bit more fairy in my life. But I did say I wanted to mention at least one more book from the shortlist of the Women's Prize for Fiction, and that is The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gower. This is a beast of historical fiction that, again, I've seen so much hype around, and I'm really excited to get to it for myself because a lot of people I know online and offline have loved this book. My flatmate's actually currently reading it and says it's great. My friend Jill adores it and I trust their opinions. So this one is set in the late 1700s and it is full of brothels and high society and desire and mysterious characters, lives intersecting, and of course a mermaid that has been discovered and is now being put on show to the public. And I've heard the historical detail of this one is particularly beautiful and immersive, so that gets me really pumped. My next three books, however, and I am almost at the end, are all from Page Habit boxes. So I've had two boxes I haven't had a chance to show you yet. So the first one I got in my thriller box, or the mysteries box that I get every month, is a new release mystery book, and that is Dodging and Burning by John Copenhaver. This one is actually set in the 1940s, and it says, in the summer of 1945, Celia Bliss is a lonely 12-year-old tomboy mourning the loss of her brother, Robbie, who is declared missing in the Pacific. She tries to piece together his life by rereading his favourite pulp detective story, A Date with Death, and spending time with his best friend, Jay Greenwood, in Royal Oak. One unforgettable August day, Jay leads Celia and Bunny to a stretch of woods where he found a dead woman, but when they arrive, the body is gone. They soon discover a local woman named Lily Vellum is missing and begin to piece together the threads of her murder, starting with a photograph Jay took of her abandoned body. So this is actually a little bit different from me. I've not read a lot of mystery books that were set in the 1940s, and the fun thing about Page Habit, as I always mention, is that these books are annotated by the author. That's one of the perks of getting the subscription box, is that little post-its are scattered throughout this with the author's thoughts on what they were thinking when they were writing that book, or what they want you to know as a little outside detail, fun little facts as you're reading, and that adds a whole new dimension to the reading. So I'm excited to get to another mystery from that box because they always send me new and exciting mysteries, and they're usually quite literary as well. Then I have two more books that I got in my next subscription box where you can actually add on another book from another genre without paying for an entirely new box. So I ended up with my standard mystery as well as a fantasy novel. So this mystery is actually set in the 1800s, so another historical one, but even further back. And it is Why Kill the Innocent by C.S. Harris. This one begins with the brutal murder of a young woman, and our detective has to solve that mystery. I believe this is actually part of a series with the same central detective. I need to do a little bit of research, but I don't know if I should necessarily find that a deterrent to reading this because I mean, I read all of the Sherlock Holmes books out of order and did from the beginning. You can do the same with Poirot as long as it's a standalone story within a larger series. I think I can read it, so I'm going to do a little bit of research, but I'm excited to have another early 1800s mystery. And then I have The Wolf by Leo Carew. So this is a fantasy novel. From what I gather from the blurb, this one is going to be about a war between two races of people. One an ancient race who live for centuries, the other who have much more fleeting lives, I imagine more like a human life. So it sounds like a good old epic fantasy book, and I am so into fantasy at the moment. I'm getting back into it. I'm really loving reading more fantasy, so I'm pleased to have more on my shelf. But just to be clear, I am sent my Page Habit boxes for free, although I'm not obliged to share them with you. I'm lucky enough to get them for free, and I always enjoy discovering new things through them. I will link the subscription service down below. Those are all the books I had to show you though. No mean number whatsoever. We have been here for quite some time. I do apologise, although I'm sure you enjoy book hauls if you've stuck around to this point in the video. I don't mind a long video, as I'm sure you can tell from my channel already. But I'd love to know your thoughts on any of the books I've mentioned in this video. Let's get chatting. Let me know if you'd like me to include books I get out of the library in future book hauls, because I'd happily do that if that's something you'd like to see. It's still showing you what I'm going to read, even if it's not showing you what books I'm adding to my bookcase. But I now have some tidying up to do since I'm surrounded by books on the floor. So without further ado, thanks for watching. Do give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye. Why am I doing this? My hands are so sore.